So, good morning. I hope everybody's doing. I hope you're managing to keep it together and to um, find a way to make things meaningful for you as we continue to move forward. So, today I'm going to be talking about legislatures. And today I really want to focus in on getting 4 dimensions nailed down as to what the reality of the legislatures are. So what we see when we look at legislatures out in the world. And these 4 dimensions are the electoral system, okay? And by that we refer to how members of the legislature are elected. The second dimension is the structure of the legislature, and so that's related to bicameralism and the differences between presidential and parliamentary systems and those sorts of things, and we'll talk about those in more detail. The third is the role of committees in the legislature, and the fourth is the role of parties in the legislature. So I want to be clear about sort of what we're going to be doing. We're going to talk very generally about all 4 of those things today, and then we're going to set aside the second one where we talk about the structure of the system. We're going to talk more about that when we go through chapter 10 and we talk about executives. And we're also going to set aside the last of them where we talk about political parties, and we're going to talk more about party systems when we go through chapter 11. So really, this chapter is going to be about how legislators are selected and how they do their business in the legislature. But today we're going to talk very generally about all 4 of those. Okay, so in terms of electoral systems, right, there's a couple of different ways that this can be built. The first one is that we can have sort of an American-style system, right, where members of the legislature are elected in plurality, first-past-the-post, single-member districts. And what do those things mean? Plurality means that they don't have to have a majority of the votes cast. They can be elected with fewer than 50% of the vote as long as they get the most votes. The second one is, what does first past the post mean? First past the post sort of means the same thing as the plurality. It just means that he who gets the most votes, and it's usually he, except in some other systems that we'll talk about, but it's usually he, whoever gets the most votes wins. And finally, single member districts is just what it means, right? You have districts that are assigned to different geographic regions, and each of those regions elect one representative. Okay, so this is how the United States selects legislators. It's also how the United Kingdom selects legislators. Most systems use other ways of approaching this, and on Monday we're going to talk in more detail about those different types of systems. But basically, we have the first past the post single member district, what's sometimes referred to as the Westminster model, at one end of the types of legislative electoral systems. And then at the other end, we have systems like Israel's, or another example of sort of or Barbados, or a couple of other places that have sort of very proportional representation where the system is designed to reflect the partisan choices of the electorate without a whole lot of regard to the individuals that are elected. Okay, so for example, in Israel, when you cast a ballot, you don't vote for people at all. You cast a vote for the political party, and then that political party decides who goes into the Knesset based on how many seats they won. So that's basically the story of the electoral systems. And we'll talk about some variations and some systems that kind of fall between the pure proportional representation and the pure Westminster model. We'll talk about that on Monday. The second dimension that we're going to talk about is the relationship between the legislature and the executive. And again, we're going to talk in a lot more detail about this when we go through chapter 10, but for now, it's enough to keep in mind that a lot of systems, a lot of democratic systems, have an integrated executive. And by that I mean you don't cast a ballot for the head of government. The head of government is selected by the legislature and is answerable to the legislature, and could or could not, depending on how the system is structured, be able to survive losing the confidence of that legislature, so losing the majority of that legislature. For example, in true proportional systems, it can be very difficult for a single political party to win a majority of the legislative seats. And so in those cases, in order to choose a head of government, to choose a prime minister, the largest party bloc has to put together a coalition with several other political parties. And this happens in Israel, it happens in Germany, it happens in France, right? It happens in all the places where proportional systems mean that it is easy for minor political parties to come into the legislature. Those are all places where the executive can easily be brought down, right? We can easily see a situation where the government loses its ability to command a majority in the legislature and then is no longer able to remain in power. Compare this with presidential systems, right? Like the United States, like most of Latin America, like a lot of African governments, where the executive is elected separately from the legislature, has its own power base, and is not answerable to the legislature. If the legislature ceases to carry out the legislative agenda of the executive can continue to govern. Okay? So that's the major difference between presidential and parliamentary systems. Okay? Moving on to the third dimension, which is the role of committees. Okay, there are some legislatures where committees are extremely important, right? In the United States, for example, bills don't pass without successfully moving through at least one committee in each chamber. Okay. But there are other systems where committees don't play the same sort of role. In the United Kingdom, legislative committees are rare, and typically are engaged in oversight rather than lawmaking. So committees are intended to obtain answers from the government as to why certain policies were undertaken, rather than engaging in their own direct lawmaking. Okay. And finally, with regard to political parties, right, we've already talked about the issue of coalitional government and how parties become an important part of that process. But parties have an important role to play in policymaking as well. Consider, for example, right, in a coalitional system, a minor political party may want particular cabinet portfolios in order to come into government. Okay, and we'll talk more about that with Chapter 10, but by way of one example, if you are the leader of a party that is especially interested in environmental issues, you may only be willing to join a governing coalition if you are promised that your party leader will become the environmental minister. And without that promise, you will not lend your support to the governing coalition. And that's one example of sort of how parties get involved in the policymaking process in these sorts of legislative movements. The last thing that I want to mention, because it's in the book and I think it's important, but I don't think it's something that's really worth spending a lot of time talking about, is bicameralism. So bicameralism is the notion of having two chambers in the legislature. Most modern democratic legislatures are to some extent bicameral. I say that. Most may be an oversell. A lot of modern democratic legislatures are bicameral. And so what's the role of bicameralism, right? Some of it depends on what function does the second chamber serve, right? So we have sort of a broad spectrum of options, right? In the United States, the upper chamber is still extremely robust. The Senate has a significant amount of power, arguably, possibly more power than the House of Representatives right now, but certainly an equal amount of power under any sort of conception of normalcy. But then we have other systems, such as the German system, where the Bundesrat, the upper chamber, only has a role to play in certain legislative acts related to the states that they represent, right? So the members of the Bundesrat are selected by state assemblies. They're not elected by the voters, and so they are removed from federal policymaking. So, Derek, the answer to that is the question from Derek is, how does the Senate not usually have more power? And Derek, the answer to that is, this isn't a class on American politics, but here's the real answer. Basically, the framers designed Congress to have theoretically similar powers on both sides. So the Senate has a larger role to play in foreign policy than the House, and a larger role to play in personnel because of the advise and consent power, but the House has the power of the purse, right? So appropriations bills have to begin in the House. That's an extremely significant power. And the framers sort of believed that this division of labor left the two chambers more or less equal. Okay, so Dalton asks, why is bicameralism so popular? Boy, that's a great question. My best answer is, it seems like there's a lot of constitution making that takes the stance that having more than one veto player in the legislative process is a helpful piece of the puzzle, right? That it encourages good policy making. However, not every legislative chamber is created equal, right? So we talked about how the Senate is at least an equal to the House of Representatives, if not superior. We've talked about how the Bundesrat is significantly inferior to the Bundestag in Germany. In the United Kingdom, the House of Lords has no legislative role to play. It does not engage in lawmaking. All it can do is amend bills that have been passed by the Commons or delay them, but it has no independent lawmaking role. And so these are all sort of different approaches to bicameralism that sort of represent the spectrum of roles for the second chamber. But I don't think that's necessarily a problem one way or the other for democracy. I don't know if that answers your question. Derek asks, is the structure of the U.S. Senate where Wyoming and California have equal representation unusual? I mean, it seems to me that there's a lot of cases where an upper chamber is intended to represent the interests of subnational units, right? So we have the Senate in the United States, we have the Bundesrat in Germany, we have the Senate in France, that are all to some extent selected on the basis of representing the interests of subnational units. The Senate in Canada is similar, but I don't think there's any of these chambers that, like the US Senate, takes the position that every subnational unit has to be equally represented, right? There's some difference based on the distribution of population in these upper chambers, even in Canada and Germany. It seems to me. I'm not an expert on this. I'm perfectly willing to be fact checked on this and to be wrong, but that's my gut instinct, just sort of based on my own recollections. So these are sort of the 5 things that are generically what we should be focused on when we think about how legislatures work. And I realize I've sort of Spanish Inquisitioned this one by starting off with 4 things and now I have 5. But again, right, just to review, the electoral system, the legislative and executive relationship, committee structure, the role of parties, and the role of bicameralism. If we know these 5 things, we more or less know how the legislature functions. And I think that you guys can sort of draw on those 5 threads to piece together how the system is going to work in your final exams. Okay, so I'm going to log off now, but I'll be in Slack. You guys can message me, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. So Thanks so much, and I will see you guys on Monday. Bye.